Live. News First, Newsline.
Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of Newsline. Joining us on Newsline today, to discuss about the human rights situation here in Sri Lanka, especially with regard to the new legislation that has been proposed to be enacted in the country. Some of it is not so new legislation. It was gazetted before they tried to put it through Parliament. However, due to much public opposition, it was withdrawn and amended to a certain way. Let's take a look at whether or not amendments have been done to a point where it will be in line with the Constitution and protect the fundamental rights of the general public here in Sri Lanka. To discuss these matters and much more, we've got with us an executive committee member of the Young Lawyers Association, Attorney at Law Nuwan Bopage. Thank you very much for joining us on our program tonight. Mr. Bopage, first things first, this act or this piece of legislation that we're bill stage right now that we're referring to is the Anti-Terrorism Bill. Now, when it comes to terrorism-related legislation here in Sri Lanka, we have a very, very bad experience because from the 1990s, we had the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and how far it has helped us to prevent terrorism is an entirely different question, because instead of using the provisions in the PTA which grant the executive very, very wide-ranging discretion to prevent terrorism, as the Act says, we know how the Prevention of Terrorism Act was used. There is no debate there. When either party is in the opposition, they've always accused the governing party of using the PTA wrongly. However, when they do ascend to power, they do the same. And the use of the PTA was very heavily criticized, especially last year during the Aragale, during the economic crisis here in Sri Lanka, and it continues to be used improperly. And despite promises to withdraw this piece of legislation, it hasn't been withdrawn yet. But now, the Anti-Terrorism Act is being presented as an alternative. They say the PTA is bad, we know, we've promised to repeal it, now we are finally going to repeal it, but we've brought a better piece of legislation, the Anti-Terrorism Act. Is it really so?
Yeah, of course. Now, as you correctly pointed out, the Prevention of Terrorism Act is the existing law that we have. So, in fact, in 1979, that act was enacted soon after J.R. Jayawardena brought the power of the country. Then what happened was, we cannot analyze that particular act without context. It's very clear. Soon after he was appointed as president, he introduced the neoliberal economy. With that, actually, he wanted to curtail certain rights of the people and the welfare of the people. So he predicted, as a result of that, inevitably there will be people's uprising. In order to curb these uprising, he actually wanted some sort of a weapon. That was the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So throughout the last 4 decades, the people have been struggling to actually get out of this particular act, because the majority of the society get affected due to the certain draconian kind of provisions of this act. And their rights and of course their liberty was curtailed by using this act by the executive. So that experience, we have that experience, and especially in the North, Tamil and subsequently Muslims are concerned, this act has been used violating their basic fundamental rights.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but this act was mainly used to suppress minorities for an extended period of time, and people in the south, the west, the western province, and those areas didn't really feel the impact of this piece of legislation or how much harm it does to a person, to a society, because it wasn't used on them. But with the economic crisis in everybody, from the north, the south, the east and the west rising up together, there was really no discrimination on whom this act was arbitrarily enforced upon, was there? That's the reason why we feel it so much now.
Yeah, of course. Now, you know, after the detention of IUSF convener, Basanta Mudalike, in fact, the South also now start to think about the draconian nature of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Then there was a protracted debate why we cannot abolish this act, and the main argument was not to introduce a new bill, new act, the main slogan was abolish PTA because the existing laws are enough to cover most these offences. For example, in the Prevention of Terrorism Act, there's a murder and the hostage taking. All these offences were there in the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So all these offences were covered under Penal Code and the Offensive Weapon Acts like that. So therefore there was no necessity to have another separate special law because all these offences covered by the general law. The only thing is the procedure part. When there is investigation regarding terrorist kind of act, of course there must be you have to use sophisticated methods and it takes time. Then there must be a procedure arrangement for investigation.
Right.
For that you can amend the Criminal Procedure Code and give certain powers to police or CID. But when it comes to a special law, especially the detention orders are concerned, and there are various kind of draconian kind of provisions. So these provisions throughout have been used to oppress the masses, to repress the people who are fighting against the government and people who are actually raising their voice against the government. So that's what the experience we have.
So speaking about the PTA and the provisions therein, you said that the provisions are arbitrary, but there is a requirement for certain leeway in dealing with terrorism-related incidents. Is the issue, now I know this has been a very, very long debate on repealing the PTA, but just for clarity's sake, is the issue really with the provisions in the PTA or how the PTA is used by the executive? Which is worse?
So there is an intrinsic link between both the law and the practice, because as I said, at the time of implementing that particular act, there was an ulterior motive behind that. When it comes to the operational level, of course, that the real intention of that particular act was transpired by the conduct of the executive.
So there is no scenario in which the PTA can exist and be used for its intended purpose instead of arresting people like the convener of the IUSF, who a majority really don't believe to be a terrorist in the true sense of the word.
The other thing is, even from the very beginning, even the international level, there's issue how to interpret the terrorism. Of course, now if certain act could be interpreted, the state could interpret it as a terrorist act. But as far as the actual nature of that act is concerned, one can say it's not a terrorist act. For example, if a person fighting for their liberty, the state could interpret it as him as a terrorist. But when you go to the level of that particular person or his the surrounding circumstances, it is not a terrorist act. He's fighting for his liberty. So therefore, the interpretation, giving an interpretation for terrorism per se is we have to think very thoroughly, because actually you can interpret terrorism like that, because if that power has been given to the executive to interpret what is Terrorism Act, always it has been used to oppress the masses and for the benefit of the executive.
So let's speak a bit about the Antiterrorism Act, which is now in a bill stage still. Now this is the piece of legislation that has been proposed to replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Now, as much as you, Mr. Bopage, say that Sri Lanka doesn't need anti-terror laws, the government believes otherwise, and judging by the experience of Sri Lanka, maybe they're justified, maybe they're not. That's a discussion for another day. But today, let's discuss a bit about the provisions in the Anti-Terrorism Act that are now to replace. They haven't replaced it yet because it's in the bill stage, but provisions to replace the PTA in the future. You spoke a lot about the definition of terrorism. The PTA doesn't bear a definition for terrorism, only certain acts that could be interpreted by the executive as terrorist-related acts. However, this bill does contain several definitions for terrorism, or what would amount to a terrorist-related act. Has the scope broadened? Have they narrowed down the scope so that only people who are actually engaged in terrorist-related activities or terrorism per se, and that when we hear news on the television saying that this individual has been arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, we wouldn't be sitting at home laughing saying, ha ha ha, is that man really a terrorist?
Yeah, actually, now according to the proposed bill, in terms of the proposed section 3, now the executive is trying to give a definition to the offense of the terrorist. So, as you said, now in the previous act, there was no such broad definition. It has only given what are the offences. Here, apart from that, the state wanted to broaden the interpretation, saying that what are the actual act that state believe a terrorist act. For instance, it says section 3 subsection B, I read that wrongfully or unlawfully compelling the government of Sri Lanka or any other government or international organization to do or abstain from doing any act. It does mean that if somebody is protesting or somebody is raising their voice to against the state or another country.
It doesn't even say state, it says government.
Yeah, government, yes. Government, yeah, exactly. The government and any other government like India and any other international organization like IMF. So I am using these examples because it's very clear to understand this. For instance, now what the government is imposing taxes. So if a trade union activist or if a trade union is protesting against that, to asking government to reduce the taxes, it's just like to compelling government to abstain doing something. So then, in terms of this particular definition, the government could arrest him or detain him on the basis that it's a terrorist act. On the other hand, any other government, for instance, now India, they are demanding the Kachativu Island. If the people in that area is protesting against that, the government can interpret it as a terrorist act. Then the organizations, other international organizations, now IMF, they are imposing certain conditions in order to give that next loan installment. What are these definitions? That actually they wanted to cut down the benefits of the EPF. If I am a member of EPF, if I am contributing the EPF, I have a right to fight against that. Then if I am fighting, in terms of this particular provision, government can say I am a terrorist. So likewise, it has broadened the definition. At the same time, it has directly targeted people, those who are in fact challenging the decisions or policies of the government. That is why we have to take into consideration these provisions, because the contemporary discourse was to abolish the PTA. Now, actually, the government has given a pledge to the international, especially in the UNHRC, to give a moratorium to the previous act, at the same time to abolish this act. So abolishing means abolish. Now, in the guise of abolishing that, now they are bringing another bill, broadening the definition. At the same time, now previous act only had 30 to 40 sections. Now here around 100 sections. There are certain provisions like icing, but when we go through one by one, as a whole, the holistic meaning of this particular bill is very clear. Main intention, the government believe the future is not good. This economic crisis is getting worse and worse. So, in order to prevent people from fighting and demanding against the government, they can use this particular act very easy. And now there is a piece of legislation that they can use to repress the masses.
So we'll discuss a little bit more about the provisions in this new bill that has been gazetted. Don't forget that there was a previous anti-terrorism bill, same name, kind of same provisions, similar provisions at least, but the government claims that they are different because the initial anti-terrorism bill that was presented was rejected by the people, there were mass protests, and it was withdrawn. However, a new anti-terrorism bill has been brought. We'll cross over to a short commercial break and look at the differences between these two, if there are any. Stay tuned. You're watching Newsline.
News First, Newsline.
Countless people are suffering due to the arid weather conditions that have swept across the island. The lack of drinking water, however, is not just a seasonal issue to many people in rural Sri Lanka. As part of the continuous efforts to provide clean drinking water to the people of Sri Lanka, Gammatha laid the foundation stone for another drinking water project in Ukulankulama, Anuradhapura. Gammatha, for the people, by the people.
News First, Newsline.
Hello there and welcome back. You're watching Newsline. We're in discussion with an executive committee member of the Young Lawyers Association, Nuwan Bopage. We spoke before the commercial break about the anti-terrorism bill, the new bill that has been presented, and we promised our viewers that we will compare and contrast the new anti-terrorism bill from the old anti-terrorism bill that was initially I believe gazetted just a few months ago.
Yeah,
I don't think even a year.
March,
17th March, yes. This year, 17th of March, anti-terrorism bill number 1 was gazetted, and now then it was, of course, withdrawn. It was not debated in Parliament. They didn't really take the steps to pass it because there was so much opposition from the general public. Now, anti-terrorism bill number 2 has been gazetted. So, Mr. Bopage, tell me, is there really a difference between these two? What's the difference?
No, in fact, as a whole, there are no considerable changes. The few subsections and few sections have been removed, but as far as the entire previous bill is concerned, it's similar. The new gazetted bill is similar to the previous bill gazetted in last March.
So, but what really is the government thinking? I mean, in your perspective, what they said initially that the bill was, initially when they brought the anti-terrorism bill number 1, they said that this is a good alternative to the Prevention of Terrorism Act, but the people disagreed, and then they agreed or concurred with the people to a certain degree, withdrew that. Now they've brought anti-terrorism bill number 2, and if you're saying it is as bad as the previous bill, and there's no material differences between the two, are they trying to hoodwink the people?
Yeah, exactly. Because now, anyway, they want this kind of bill to continue their ruling. Only thing is, in March, they might measure what is the actual ground level situation. Now, they might believe 5 months down the line, because of, inside the parliament, they were able to establish some sort of a agreement between the members of the parliament. The way that they are behaving, it's very clear now. They have come to a certain roundtable discussion about the next steps of the country. In that sense, I think the Ranil Wickremesinghe and the people who are behind this believe that this is the ideal time to bring this kind of, once again, bring this act. So technically, they want this bill, fully implementation of the bill. But previously, they might believe the ground situation is not good. Now, they might predict the ground situation is good, them to bring this kind of a draconian bill.
But Mr. Bopage, is this the only piece of legislation that the government is trying to pass that would, necessarily impinge on the fundamental rights of the general public? At this point of time, is this the only bill?
No, recently on 17th, in fact 18th, on 18th of September, they gazetted online safety bill. It's actually that bill worse than the anti-terrorism bill. Even anti-terrorism bill, we can discuss section 10 and 11 directly affect the freedom of expression of the people. Now, as far as the online safety bill is concerned, there are a series of provisions to prevent people from expressing their ideas using social media and internet. So it's very clear there is a specific provision that if there is a post or kind of thing to provoking a struggle, is an offence under this particular act. Previously in 2022 uprising, most of the youth used the social media platform to disseminate their ideas and mobilize the people. So in this particular bill, say it's an offence. So it's very clear, the ulterior motive behind this bill is very clear. So when we consider about previous series of bills, rehabilitation bill, Inland Revenue Amendment bill, and the anti-terrorism bill, now the online safety bill, all these bills are in line with the objective of the present government. Now, they actually postponed the election. Now, the next line will be using all these provisions, they might try to hold all the election forever. So that kind of provisions are there when you think about as a whole all these provisions.
So when you speak about Sri Lankans and democracy and especially holding elections, that's one thing that we hold dear. And I believe many Sri Lankans have paid with their lives fighting for the right to elect their leaders. I believe it was during the government of J.R. Jayawardena that the election was to a certain way moved a little bit away from the constitution and what it really means, and a referendum was held, and the term of parliament was extended. There were huge questions raised as to the constitutionality of this move. However, given the situation in the country at the time, nobody could really do anything, and that government continued for an additional duration of period because of the referendum. And however, right after that, the moment Sri Lankan people got a chance to vote, I believe a 5/6 government of J.R. Jayawardena was reduced to a mere handful of members. So do you think that the things that are happening right now, because you mentioned the ATA and you mentioned that it came during that time, now you're speaking about the anti-terrorism bill, then you're speaking about the online protection bill. Do you think these two instances are similar? Do you think we're going down a similar road?
Yeah, more or less the conduct of the Ranil Wickremesinghe is now similar to his uncle J.R. Jayawardena. It's very clear, because now the only difference is J.R. Jayawardena had 5/6 power of the parliament. Here they just have 134 votes inside the parliament. Using that only he's doing all these things. But the problem is here now. The fighting against the government, fighting for their rights is a sacred right that citizens has that right to fight against the government and demand certain rights from the government. So now what they are trying to do now, the economic situation, economic crisis is concerned now. Day by day, it's getting worse and people are suffering. So the curtailing the liberty of the people is the main objective of all these acts. So now where to go now? You know, under liberal democracy, the Ranil Wickremesinghe actually he was recognized as a father of the liberal democracy of the country. So that even throughout the history, that is how he was identified. Now, but the way that he's conducting now is totally different. In 2017, when the Yahapalana government was there, the Ranil Wickremesinghe was the prime minister, and his foreign minister Mangala Samaravira gave a pledge to the United Nations not to implement the Prevention of Terrorism Act. But the same person, the Ranil Wickremesinghe, after he got power in 2002, within few months, what he did, he used the PTA and gave certain detention orders. Now the situation is far worse. Now he is going to introduce this particular anti-terrorism bill worse than the Prevention of Terrorism bill. So as you said, it's very clear now, as far as the democracy of the country is concerned, now there will be this conduct of the government, this conduct of the Ranil Wickremesinghe regime is directly affect the people's right, especially the fundamental rights of the people, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly. Therefore, I think we believe we can't expect a different opinion from the parliament. Definitely, they will raise their hands in favor of this particular bill because they all are together. So I think the people have to raise their voice against this government, especially the progressive movements, progressive parties have to take this to their hand and fight against government to defeat this particular bill.
Speaking a bit about the online protection bill, that too has some concerning provisions at least. It speaks about a commission that is appointed by the president that will be vested with quite a weird power, the power to determine what is true and what isn't. Now, would you mind giving our viewers a little bit of a definition of what this really means? Because, like the number 6, maybe if I look at it from one side, I'd see a 6. You look at it from the other way and you'd see a 9. That's something, when you speak about truth, it's quite subjective.
Yes.
So how is the Act really planning on accomplishing that arduous task of deciding what is true?
Exactly. Now, this so-called online safety commission, the members are being appointed by the president. Now, president is appointing a group of people, and for what purpose? Now, this particular commission has been given vast powers in terms of the section 11 of the Act, and it says that they can, the particular commission could take decisions, could make statements, could prohibit from people against a prohibited statements. Then from section 14 onwards, in fact from section 12 onwards, it says false statements, as you said. Now it says warrantly giving provocation by false statement to cause riot. That's section I mentioned previously. Now, how to define this false statement? This commission is there to define that. Commission has been appointed by the president. Then going further, disturbing the religious assembly by a false statement. Then prohibition of communication of false statement of fact in Sri Lanka. Then communication of false statement amounting to contempt. Likewise, it's moving further. So it's all these things are decided by a particular commission appointed by the president.
So, Mr. Bopage, we're in the final few minutes of the show, so just to give an idea to the general public who are watching us right now as to maybe what this commission is capable of, say, in a different dimension, you are appointed as a member of this commission by the current president of Sri Lanka, and I make a statement saying that, the president of Sri Lanka is the best president in the world, and you don't agree with me, you think it's a lie. Would you be able to, impose penal sanctions against me, or at least recommend penal sanctions against me, prescribe me from making such statements?
No, it's happened otherwise, because in fact this commission will definitely throughout the history we know how the executive used the ICCPR Act. The section 3 of the ICCPR Act has used not to expand the freedom of expression of the people, but to curtail it. Likewise, if people are giving favorable statement to government, if they are actually all their opinions are in favor of the government, that is the expectation of the
But
government.
what if I say the president isn't fit to be president? Then?
Sorry?
If I say the president isn't fit to be president?
Of course. Then in terms of this particular new bill, that statement could be considered as a prohibited statement, and the commission can take action against that.
Thank you very much, Attorney at Law Nuwan Bopage, for joining us on our program tonight. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in, and do keep in touch, of course, and stay up to date about these new pieces of legislation, because who knows, maybe some statements that you're making today could be prohibited tomorrow. Take care and God bless.